Hi there, and welcome back to the Energy Sector Heroes podcast. My name is Michelle Fraser, and every week I will speak with incredible people who share their lessons, experiences, and stories from their time spent in the energy sector. Hi there, and welcome back again to this week's episode. If you're new to the show, then please take a second to subscribe and even consider sharing the show with just one other person. This week, I am joined by Dave Lattin. Dave is an accomplished chairman and non-executive director in the energy sector, a global leader with a proven track record in executive leadership and investment. Dave, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hello, Michelle. It's great to be here. Gosh, what to say? I'm a geologist by background. I started out in the world. Actually, I started out in the world as an art student, but that's part of the story, which is all involving change. And I've been working one way or another in the energy sector since the early 90s.
Excellent. Excellent. I've had a lot of geologists. They're doing very well. All of them have done really well for themselves. Very clever people. So how did you get started off in the energy sector then?
Well, I went to university, actually. I went to Newcastle University to do a degree in geography and politics, having not really done anything very scientific at school in my A-levels. And after the first year, I bumped into geology and decided I wanted to be a geologist. And they let me start all over again and scratch their heads about, whether I could do a science degree, given the fact that I'd failed A-level maths and didn't have any other sciences in my A-levels. But they let me have a crack at it, and turned out I enjoyed it and was quite good at it. So I went on and did a PhD after that, and a postdoctorate after that in different universities. So I went to Edinburgh, and then I went to Cambridge, and then I joined BP. And that was where my journey started in energy.
How did you stumble across geology? What made you decide to change? Because that's quite a big leap, actually.
Yeah, well, they had, so for people doing arts degrees, you could do a science degree first year course in a science for sort of non-scientists. So I did the geology course at Newcastle for non-scientists. And what I realized was I'd loved geography because it was very broad, right? It covered all sorts of things from, human sociology and bits of economics and bits of geology and how ice sheets moved and all that kind of stuff in geography. And they started teaching bits of geology in the geography. And what I realized was they weren't doing a very good job of it. And the geologists were teaching it properly. And I thought, well, goodness me, if everything they're doing is a bit like that, what's the point? So I decided to sort of start all over again. And part of it was, well, maybe there'd be a job in the oil industry at the end of it, because maybe I'll be more employable as a science graduate with some skills in geology. But that was only part of it. It was mainly just that the geology had interested me and seemed like they were doing it properly. And I was a bit worried they weren't in geography, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. The other question I was going to ask you was, you mentioned that you did a PhD and then you did a doctorate.
Yeah.
Are they not one and the same thing? Because I've never heard of it before.
No, the PhD was they usually take 3 or 4 years. I did mine in 3 years, and it was funded by the Natural Environment Research Council back in those days. And I did it in Edinburgh with one foot in Cambridge, so it was spread between the two places. And when I finished that, so I was then I got my doctorate. I had actually been offered a job by BP at that point, and I'd also been part funded by Shell during my PhD. But I hadn't really got the academic thing out of my system, and I'd been given the opportunity. I'd applied for a research grant, and I'd been given the opportunity to do 5 years as an academic at Cambridge, funded for 5 years, it was to go where I wanted, but I chose to go to Cambridge and to carry on doing similar research, the research I've been doing in my PhD, which was all to do with volcanoes and plate tectonics. It wasn't really anything to do with oil and gas at all. But there was a tenuous link to oil and gas because the samples so my PhD was about how, when you stretch the Earth's crust, you create volcanic rifts. And quite a famous volcanic rift in the oil industry sits in the middle of the North Sea and is Jurassic of age. And I was getting samples from that from BP and Shell and Hess and all of the oil companies because they were drilling through volcanics and taking cutting samples or cores sometimes. So my PhD was using samples from the oil industry. So I generated a bit of a network amongst the geoscientists at senior levels in the oil companies to do my PhD.
I didn't know that. No, I never knew that there was anything volcanic.
Yeah. So if you take, the Kenya Rift system is very famous because it's active and runs down the middle of Africa. And when it finally stops being volcanically active, probably, that the whole of Africa will sag and go underwater eventually, and sediments will get piled in over the top. That's what happens with rift systems quite often. And the North Sea's got basically buried there in the Triassic and Jurassic age. You've got a rift system which had volcanic activity centered around the 40s, which is where three arms of the rift come together in what's called a triple junction. And then you had volcanoes all along the edges of that rift system. And then it all went down underwater during the Jurassic and Cretaceous and Tertiary and got covered over with sand and mud, which is where a lot of the oil and gas fields are now, in those sands, being sealed by the muds that came later often.
Okay.
But volcanoes underneath.
No, I didn't know that. How would that affect actually the drilling then?
Well, sometimes it's not much fun drilling through volcanic rocks because it can be pretty hard and tough to drill through. And sometimes, depending on what they are, they can be mistaken for something interesting. So quite often on the seismic back in those days, people weren't always clear what it was when it was volcanic. And when you go west of Shetland, the other side of the UK, there were all sorts of problems because there's a lot of volcanic material there related to the opening of the Atlantic rift system, which is, of course, the present-day Atlantic Ocean.
Okay.
Anyway, we're doing a lot of geology here.
I never knew that. No, I never knew that. Okay. Okay. So getting back to your career, you did your post PhD.
Well, I did 3 years of that, yeah, and
Yeah.
then decided to join. Well, I was lucky to be offered a job by BP, but I guess why did I move into the oil and gas sector? And I think the honest answer is, and this has cropped up for me a lot through my life, there comes a point where I realize that the options are closing down for one reason or another. And I'm all about having choice and doing things which open options up. And I think that's a good sort of rule for life in general. And what I realized was I was reaching the grand old age of sort of 28, 3 years into my postdoc. And I thought, gosh, if I want to go into the oil industry, I'm going to have to move because pretty soon I'm going to get sort of dyed in the wool as an academic and I might find it hard to escape. And the problem I saw with being an academic is you dig an ever deeper trench in the same area of expertise, and then you can't jump out because it gets deeper and deeper and you get sort of typecast, right? So I thought, oh, I'm going to get typecast and also maybe not use some of the other things that I developed, which was an ability to perhaps work with other people and be very collaborative. And academics typically don't get rewarded for that unless they're working in laboratory situations in big groups. But in geoscientists, there's quite a lot of sort of solo adventurers sort of trying to do better than the others. And it's a bit of a dog eat dog world, actually, in my experience.
Okay. So do you think it's quite dangerous to get typecast in your career then?
I think it depends what you want, right? But I've always had a sort of have mind, will, travel attitude, right? So I like learning. I like growing and learning new things. And so for me, quite often, change has occurred where I've seen the opportunity to move to something that opens more opportunity to learn and grow and more options. So I'll give you another example. So is it dangerous to be typecast? Not necessarily, right? Not necessarily. Some people make their whole career out of focusing ever deeper on one thing and they love it and they're passionate about it and they're really good at it. Now, the thing I love and I'm passionate about is making connections, right, between different things. And in order to do that, you have to move across areas a bit, right? So an example would be after I joined BP, I became a reservoir engineer. So I joined as an exploration geologist, but I moved into reservoir engineering quite quickly, like after about a year or so. And people didn't generally do that. And I did it because I just thought I would be exposed to more interesting aspects of the business in a reservoir engineering role where I'd see different disciplines come together and integrate more. And BP was going through one of these downturns and getting rid of a lot of exploration geologists. So that was a good incentive to kind of move out of exploration geology as well. So that's just another example, right, of crossing boundaries, arts to sciences. So, geography to geology, and then academia to oil industry, and then within oil industry, from geology to reservoir engineering, and then later into general management and a whole bunch of other exciting stuff that came later.
So, how did you progress to general management from being quite a specialised discipline?
Well, I think people are wired in different ways, right? And I think I was always somebody that was sort of one of my strengths was collaborating and working with groups of people and facilitating conversations, if you like, and that was recognized relatively early on. And so the first leadership role, the management role, was in the subsurface.
Mm.
So clearly, I'd worked in reservoir engineering. I'd worked as a geologist. I understood a fair bit of geophysics. So that was an obvious step. But the next step was to kind of push me into something more uncomfortable, which was my first general management role was actually all of BP's projects in the North Sea. So there was a whole portfolio of capital projects. And gosh, I didn't know what I was doing, frankly. But I had a team of really good people there who did, right? And the trick, they were kind enough to let me learn from them. But the trick I think, as a leader, particularly one that's sort of learning, but maybe always, is to recognize you're there to help the team succeed. And you don't need to know everything, right? In fact, assuming you don't know everything is probably quite a good place to start. And you can't know everything. If you're the CEO of a company, you can't possibly know everything, right? You have to learn to work with and get the best from the team around you. And so that was very much, what I learned as I went into general management. And then I moved into sort of all sorts of weird and wonderful things. I forgot about one actually. Before I did that general manager role, I had a stint in HR and IT. And I was responsible for sort of putting BP's HR systems on the internet, or the intranet as it was, so that people could access stuff about what they were being paid, their pensions, their job opportunities. And that was all completely new. And at the time, BP had a CEO called John Brown, Lord Brown now, who always did everything in 90 days. And he wanted to make the company digital in 90 days back then. And he saw that driving 100,000 people onto the web because they wanted to be there, because they could find their pension details and their latest pay packet details and job opportunities, was the way to do it. And I was tasked with doing that. Why? Gosh, I don't know. I'd been put on the sort of executive development program that they had. So they've got a program for people who could be future execs in the company. And I was one of them. And what they tend to do is throw you into all sorts of interesting and difficult, challenging situations. So that was my first challenging situation, having been a subsurface team leader prior to that. And then after that, I went into this North Sea general management role, stayed in the North Sea for 7 years then, and took over a big operation, which is now Serica, actually. It's the same assets, that operation. But that's another story, right? But Bruce was the big field, Bruce and Rum, and I took those over. Rum had been one of the projects in the projects portfolio I had, and stayed for 7 years. And we had 3 children, and then I went off to Houston to run IT for the whole of BP's upstream business.
Okay, that's a huge jump through. So going from subsurface team leader to to working in their IT, that is quite
Yeah, no, these are all kind of interesting big jumps, and I was so lucky. The company at the time sort of was open to giving people like me chances like that, right? And so, yeah, from subsurface team leader to a stint in HR and IT, and then 7 years in the North Sea running operations and learning about all of the big issues to do with running big offshore operations, the safety, process safety, and all of those sorts of issues, and all of the people issues. And then to run the IT organization across all the different continents and countries and with huge budget. And then after that, actually, I had a stint in technology, because a big piece of IT is about the connection to technology. So it was at the beginnings of how do you use real-time data flows to manage the upstream business better. And we in BP, it was called Field of the Future at the time. And so I ran that, which was very exciting. And then we set up a global projects organization to manage all of BP's capital spend in one place. And so I went back to the subsurface to be responsible for the subsurface of all of BP's capital projects all over the world as part of that projects organization.
Okay. So, yeah, there's quite a few things you can unpack from that. But I just wondered, you were going back to what you were saying, that you obviously, when you were subsurface team leader, that you didn't really. It's hard for anybody to know everything. But how do you, under that circumstances, how do you get the best out of your team?
Ah, yeah. Well, I think different people do that in different ways, right? I mean, I personally, I think the way to do it is not to be a micromanager, but it's to find out what each person in the team is passionate about. That's one thing. Is to be really approachable, right? Part of the team rather than superior to and above and out of reach of the team. So part of the team, understanding the individuals, what motivates each individual. Everybody leads complicated lives, right? So they all come to work wanting to do their best. Each of us does, but we're all good at different things. So you have to work out what everybody in the team's really good at and make sure they're doing the stuff they're good at, because that's usually the stuff they love, right? And don't give people stuff they hate to do if you can, right? I mean, I don't like doing stuff I hate doing. Sometimes you have to, right? But if you can find the sweet spot is to make sure everybody's doing the stuff they love and to make sure everybody's really clear on where we're all headed together, right? On what the
Okay.
goal is. And I think that's how you work with a team, right? And the fact that you have a shared goal and you're doing the stuff that you love and you're helping each other and you're respecting each other. Some people are very, very focused on nuts and bolts and detail, and some people are more big picture. Some people are really good at sitting in a corner and doing calculations, and some people are not very good at that, but they're good at explaining to others things. So it's about just looking at what does every person bring to the table, and how do you get the best out of every person, and that's about. I mean, it's what's the word I'm looking for here? Yeah, working with people, leading people, right? It's a touchy feely thing. It's not a. It's nothing more than that, right? It's just about people. Have I answered your question, Michelle?
I think you do. You have, because you did touch on micromanaging. You think that you shouldn't micromanage then?
Well, I think there's different at different times. Leaders need to do different things, right? And so some people need more help and support than others at certain times. And I always had a model in my mind that what's leadership really about? It's about providing support. It's about setting boundaries, right? And the boundaries are things we will and won't do, right? Support is what the individual perhaps needs. Providing direction, which is where the focus is, what we're doing as a team, what you need to do as an individual to help the team. And here's the support I'll give you. And here are the boundaries. Do this, but don't do that. But in the middle of that triangle, if you like, those three things, there's trust, right? And when somebody's doing a great job, you increase the space, you increase the trust. when they're having challenges or difficulties, sometimes you need to get more involved, right? And so you decrease the space. You take away a little bit of trust sometimes. Trust, space, they're not necessarily synonymous, but you get the idea. So
Yeah.
yeah, and also, in times of crisis, right? Probably the leader needs to step in a little bit more and be a bit more directive. And that's not necessarily micromanaging, but in a crisis situation, you don't really want everybody sitting around having a great big debate and being all very well, it's collaborative, but it's a different setting, right? When you're managing a crisis and you need the leader to perhaps be a bit more directive and hands-on than when you're brainstorming a new strategy, for example.
Okay. But then it's hard. It would be hard for a lot of leaders to know when to step in when things are maybe not going so well. How do you know when the time is right?
I think it's a great question. It's an art, isn't it? Leadership, and if anything, I've learned more and more about that as I've gone on, and I think sometimes it's when you see that the performance, it's the early indicators that the performance is not going quite so well. But it's also about having the dialogue often enough and open enough that people will ask for help. So sometimes you can feel it. You can just feel it that things aren't working quite right. And you then say, okay, what's going on here? What's the root cause? How can I help? And you get closer naturally, right? As you start to see the performance, if you like, the leading indicators of performance, not perhaps being what you would expect them to be. So, for example, if you start to see some of the safety performance dropping off, actually, you want to see it before the safety performance drops off, right? You want to see it in the leading indicators, the inputs dropping off. Why aren't people going offshore as much as they were? Why aren't they having as many safety conversations as they were? Why aren't we seeing as many near misses being reported as we were and investigated as we were? Why isn't the near miss quality as good as it was before? So it's about looking at trends, right? And trying to spot how trends are developing over time and then intervening in an appropriate way.
Okay. Because
And
I
most of all, actually, Michelle, and this will sound like a really weird answer,
yeah, go on.
it's about staying awake, right? So the thing that I've been fortunate enough to be taught through my career is a concept which I've used quite a lot with myself and others, and I call it sort of being above the line.
Uh-huh.
What's the line? The line is this sort of place between existing in a sort of stressful state
Mm.
and when we go below the line, we fall into a state of starts with stress, and the further you go down, perhaps the more stress and the more anxiety and the more lost in thoughts about oneself one becomes, right? And we all do this, right? And I kind of think of it in archetypes. Just below the line, you've kind of got the warrior,
Uh-huh.
right? And everybody's ready for the fight and are fighting the good fight, and it feels like a fight. You can go into organizations that are full of warriors, and you probably recognize in yourself, you can have days or moments in a day when you've gone into warrior mode,
Uh-huh.
right? And actually, further down, it gets worse because you become the anxious politician. And no one really trusts anybody else, and everybody starts to get a bit paranoid, and people are sort of saying things about each other or watching each other's backs and their own backs, not each other's backs, right? They're looking for opportunities to kind of put a knife in somewhere else. That's a really unpleasant place to be below the line, right? That far down.
Mm.
And when you get right down at the bottom, you've got casualties. Right? You've got people that are really feeling like victims. So that's below the line, right? And every now and then I'll feel that I have a moment of a day, or I'll have a day or two, or maybe even a week or two sometimes when I'm below the line to a greater or lesser extent. Above the line is totally different. Above the line, we're gradually more awake. And what that means is we're not so lost in our own little thoughts and our own little mind games and our own little world. We start to connect with others. And the conversation changes from me to we, right? And it becomes more collaborative, and it becomes, oh, more powerful, much more powerful. So as you move above the line, you become awake, right? And of course, right at the top, so you can go to from warriors, you go to sort of corporate stewards, people that are holding it all steady, looking out for each other. And as you go further up, maybe you get to moments of mage-like qualities, right? You start to get creative, right? Do really interesting things. And then sage-like qualities, right? Goodness knows, Buddha probably spent a lot of his time way above the line. I don't know whether this is making sense, but you can, or even quite how we got here, but you can go into organizations and you can sense whether they're spending their time well below the line or whether they're actually that most of their time is somewhat above the line from how people behave together, how they are, right?
Do you think so? How do you get someone to refocus on being from below the line to being above the line?
Well, the biggest lesson I learned in my life is it's about the conversation I have with myself. And if you could get somebody to change the conversation they're having with themselves, so that's part of it, right? So it's the stories I tell myself to move me from me to we and where we're headed together. But
Mm-hmm.
I think there's another piece, which is, do you know, when I do things for other people without expecting anything back, I'm in a completely different space from when I'm doing it because I want something. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know whether you recognize that, but so when you're working with a team of people and you're just trying to help each other because it's in the best interest of everybody, that's different from when you're just doing something out of self-interest.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Self-focused, self-interested, selfish behavior is below the line. Now we all go there, right? I mean, we all have times there. The challenge in life and in business, because they're not divorced from each other, is to be above the line more of the time, to be awake more of the time, right? And when we are, we can see what's going on, right? Because it starts with being mindful of oneself. Like, what am I thinking about right now? Am I just thinking about how I'm showing up to you and the people listening, or I'm actually genuinely trying to share something and it frankly doesn't matter very much. People will take from it what they want, right? Well, better the latter, actually. If I'm worrying, what I'll say won't be genuine, won't be authentic. Right. So it starts with me and how I'm thinking, how I'm managing my mindfulness. Then it goes on to thinking about you, right, and others. So am I mindful of kind of, the audience and the audience could be just one person I'm in a room with, right? And then the next level is are we mindful of the greater context within which we're operating? An oil and gas industry that sits inside an energy industry that's changing dramatically, that's got all sorts of challenges, could be one context for the conversation, or it could be you and me talking about leadership and managing teams of people, which might be separate to that. So mindful of self, mindful of others, mindful of the greater context. I'm beginning to sound like I'm preaching, but I genuinely think, mindfulness for me is a key in how I now try and live my life in ever more complex roles, actually.
Yeah, and I do resonate with what you're saying because I have met over the many, many years I've worked in different organizations that there are people that are below the line. It can be difficult.
We all are to a greater or lesser extent, right? I mean, sometimes, we put chemicals into our bodies and it'll take us below the line because we're unconscious. Sometimes, because it's being below the line is being less conscious, really, right? It's just less conscious. And some individuals, have got chemicals, but that make them depressed, right? And it's just a sort of, a chemical imbalance that causes depression, right? And that they can be below the line for big periods of time. Right? I have a relative who gets very depressed, clinically depressed for periods of time, and is well below the line. Now, the flip side is that person also gets chemicals that makes them clinically high, right? And that isn't what I mean by being above the line, by the way. It's another form of chemical unconsciousness. It just has a different feeling that in that particular instance. But yeah, I mean, some people spend more of their time worrying about their own thoughts and their own feelings and their own little world, than others. And some organizations are more focused on themselves than others, right? Does that make and we all go through phases, we'll have periods of time when we're more like that than others. We'll have good weeks and bad weeks. We'll have chemical changes. We have moods, right? We're all human. The trick is to move everything up a bit so that the average is more above than below.
But that's going to be really hard to do, though.
Well, I think it's a lifelong, for me, it's been a process. And I wouldn't say I've cracked it, right? But I do think it starts with wanting to do it. And I was lucky enough to meet some people, during my journey, who inspired me that this was the way to be, right? And it does make a difference, because every now and then I'll find myself going down into that hole, right? And I think, and I'll spot myself and have to pull myself out of it, because it's impossible to be a balanced, healthy, inspiring leader and a victim at the same time, and selfish and self-centered and lost in my own thoughts. How can I do that? Leadership's about service fundamentally, right? And when you're the chairman of a company, as I am now, my job is to serve the board and the company. It's not about me and my ego and my little needs. I forget that from time to time, of course, because I'm human, right? But my job is a job of service, and actually that it's about making sure, the board's role is to be a good guardian of the baby, and the baby is the company, right? The parents are perhaps the shareholders, but the baby is the company, and the board has got to be like a really good guardian. It's got to worry about what's best for the baby. And all the chairman does is facilitate the process. No more important than anybody else. But you can't do that if you're lost in worrying about yourself all the time. You just can't do it.
But then it is challenging to be on a chair or on the board of directors, though, because I think you would have to, because you would have a lot of consequences to think about.
You do. It's complicated, but I don't think, lots of people have challenging jobs, right? It's a different kind of challenging job. I mean, I don't think it's any more challenging than, worrying about the safety of the people working with you and for you if you're offshore installation manager, and arguably less important. Has perhaps more consequences. Well, no, they both have consequences attached, right? Legal obligations, right? But yeah. I mean, everybody has important stuff to do. I think that the thing that we're all inclined to forget sometimes is it's not just about us. We're not working in isolation, any of us, right? And so, probably I talked a lot about choice earlier, right? And I talked about connections. Collaboration is my other C word. I mean, we don't work, we can't exist in isolation, right? And back to the leading people thing that we talked about earlier, everybody's different, finding their passions, and trying to motivate people by allowing them to do what they love. You can't do that if you're not thinking about other people and trying to put yourself in their shoes and see the world through their eyes, right? And if you're below the line, you're not doing that. You can't. You're just lost in your own little selfish world, right?
You are.
And we all do it, right? We all do it because it's the human condition.
It is right, actually. It is. So do you think the ideal manager would ultimately be someone that's above the line?
Above the line more of the time, or trying to be. And what managers, leadership, I don't know, that they get confused, right? But for me, the very best leaders that I've ever come across are people who, when they're with you, they're with you. You can feel they're with you, right? You're connecting. What allows them to do that? They're above the line. They're awake. They're not worrying about all their own little problems, right? They're with you. That gives them presence. And I think the best leaders are just present more of the time. They're there, right? They're not thinking about what's going on somewhere else or wondering about the phone call they've got in 10 minutes time or what emails just come in, right? When you're with somebody, have you ever been with someone that wasn't there?
Yeah,
Right. How does that feel?
it's difficult.
Yeah. Have you ever been that person?
Maybe it's sometimes, but no, I try and be, as you would say, above the line to try and to be more team orientated to help the good of the project along.
But it's so easy to fall, into that unconscious space, right? I mean, I've got three children, right? How often are they come sort of wanting my attention? I'm busy doing something else, and I don't sort of put the other thing down, switch everything else off, turn and give them undivided attention. But that's what it requires sometimes, right? Or someone will come in and talk to me, and I'm just kind of not 100% there for them. And people feel that. People notice that, right? And I think we all do that to a greater or lesser extent. The less we can do it, the better. The more present we are, the better, in my view. Because then we'll pick up on all sorts of things, how the other person's really feeling, what maybe they're not saying, what they maybe need to hear at that moment in time, etc.
I think I do. I do agree, actually. I do agree. But it is really hard for maybe anybody to be above the line 90% of the time.
Yeah, no, that well, none of us are Buddha, right? Or Jesus or whoever else you want to hold up as being kind of sage-like above the line all the time. But the thing is, I think, to come to sort of the role of boards have to think about lots of different things. And it is complicated, right? And you've got a whole gamut of different stuff, some of which maybe as an individual you don't understand that well, right? There'll be some people on the board that really understand how to raise capital and how to manage debt and the financing of a company. And there'll be other people who really understand operational issues and how to manage safety leadership and what process safety is all about. And there'll be other people who understand mergers and acquisitions. But it's hard to be the one person that understands everything about everything, right? So again, perfect example of how if you've got a team of people together and collectively you manage to worry about the common good and stay awake and not get lost in your own little, selfish little world, that's what you need to deal with the complexity of a company, right?
Yeah.
You have to be able to look across all these different areas and try to together to understand the best course of action and direction, best choices.
Yeah. Yeah, that is true. How do you go about getting approached to be maybe on the board of directors? What
Oh,
skills do you need?
yeah. Now that's well, gosh, that's quite an interesting question to answer because I can tell you how it happened for me was I wasn't even looking for it, which was kind of interesting. I had been and failing. I went through a period of my life where I went through a lot of failure, which is always a kind of interesting learning time, right? And I'd kind of got to the point where I'd given up, and then I just started helping people without expecting anything very much. And then all sorts of good things started to happen. It was really weird. So I'm not answering your question. How do you get a board role? I think the first thing you need to do is have the right kind of CV, right? But it so for example, specifically about my situation was they needed somebody in Serica at the time I was asked to join who knew about the oil and gas business, had a geoscience background because one of the original board members was going to rotate out, right? Had a bit of a relationship with BP, who were an important company for Serica at the time, still are, but at that time particularly important. And it just turned out I had all of those things, and I used to run all of the assets that Serica had taken over from BP when I was in BP. So it was almost like a sort of square peg for a square hole, right? So I just my CV and everything was almost like a perfect fit. Now, that's not a great answer, right? Because it doesn't really help. I think my advice to anybody that wanted to position themselves for a board role would be to start to find out about what it entails, right? Perhaps do some of the training. There are great places. The Institute of Directors does great training. The FT does great training courses. There are good books to read about what does being a board director actually involve. You might not want to be one when you've read some of them, right? But because it involves quite a lot. And then I think it's about staying in the conversation with as many people as possible. Because although there are headhunters and there are formal searches, quite often it's about, I'm afraid, still a bit about who you know. There's still quite a bit of that.
You
And it's
think that?
difficult for there not to be, because at the end of the day, what you're trying to decide, I mean, we brought two people onto the Serica board a while ago, actually. And one of them I'd never met before. I didn't know at all, right? And she's fabulous, right? And the other one I did know a bit, but the other board directors didn't. But we did use a search company to find those two people. And we had some criteria we were using to screen who we wanted. And there was a big list of people that were brought to us and a whole process to try and work out who would be the best fit in terms of the skills that the board required to have, and who would fit with the community of people that the board is, right, in terms of personalities and so forth. So you've asked me a big question. I'm not sure I've given you a very good answer, but I think there are a number of aspects, right? There's building the network, there's understanding what a board role requires, there's getting some training or reading some books to help with that. And it's also recognizing that you're probably going to have to go and try for quite a lot of things until you find the thing that fits. I was just a bit lucky with that. The thing that fits found me, but that's often not the case.
Okay. So usually the best things find you, and it probably takes a long time as well.
But can do, I guess. My experience is that life is a. I mean, we go back to another life experience, and apologies for this, but I think life's about planting seeds and being open to the world, right? So I had planted seeds in terms of building relationships with the previous chairman of Serica and some of the board without ever aspiring to be on the board of Serica, really. There was one point in time I was just being helpful to the previous chair, right? Our paths had crossed, and I was involved in private equity. After I was with BP, I went to OMV, which is another good size oil company. Then I left and started some businesses, one of which was a private equity fund. And he and I bumped into each other when I was doing that. And I just tried to be helpful at one point in time, and he didn't forget me. And then I met him another time and tried to help again, just with nothing expected, actually. And then at the end of that conversation, I said, "Oh, if you ever need a non-executive director to replace so and so on the board, don't forget I might be suitable." So I planted a seed, right? And then I forgot about it for 2 years. So when he did call me up 2 years later, I wasn't expecting it to be that at all. I thought it was something completely different that he was kind of calling me about.
Okay.
So yeah, these things take time, yeah.
I think that's one of the major things that even with me going in my life, I think a good message is I think things do take time to materialize. You could be sitting there waiting impatient, and you just have to bite the bullet and just ride it out to see where it goes.
Yeah, it's taken me a long time to learn that, you scatter seeds, you remain open, and then you let go. We can't control the universe, right? None of us, much as we'd like to, right? And the more frustrated I get trying to make everything happen exactly as I want it to be, the worse it gets, promise you. So the more I can kind of relax and let go, having done my best, and then relax and let go, the better life gets. And again, if I can do so above the line, rather than worrying about me all the time, worrying about the people around me and just trying to be helpful in the world, as you're doing with this, actually, the better life gets. It's like a boomerang, right? You put stuff out and it comes back in unexpected ways. I mentioned that I went through a patch where I was very down. I applied for 35 jobs in 1 year and got rejected from all of them, right? Because like my private equity adventure had failed. And so I applied for 35 jobs and I got rejected from all of them. I got more and more desperate. They got weirder and weirder. I won't embarrass anybody by saying some of the weird stuff I applied for, but it started out as sort of oil and gas CEO type things, and it ended up as something really quite odd. And that was because of all the rejection I was getting. And it wasn't about me. It's just the fit wasn't right. The timing wasn't right. And as I got more desperate, it got more difficult. And in the end, I just gave up. And in the middle of COVID, I said, you know what I'm going to do? Somebody inspired me to put something on LinkedIn and offer leadership coaching for people that needed help and support. And I did. And from that, I got a whole bunch of interesting people. I got inundated with people, actually. And then I developed a whole course based on my sort of 20 or 30 years of experience. And I gave that away to a whole bunch of people, and a lot of them still in touch with me. And almost like a snowball of positivity grew out of that moment on my knees that kind of culminated in, somewhere in early 2020.
Yeah. And
Life has its ups and downs.
Yeah, and you've never looked back since.
Well, I'm happy, right? I enjoyed what I'm doing, and I think for a while I'd forgotten that life's not about striving after stuff necessarily. Life's about contributing, and it's back to going above the line again. So the leadership training I was doing was teaching this business this concept of being above the line versus below the line, and how to take control's the wrong word, but be mindful of our thinking, and how to, thoughts are very powerful things. They're really powerful things. And we get the world we choose to look at or choose to see. So if I see a world where everybody's out to get me, that's the world I'll get. And if I see a world that's full of opportunities and people that are helpful, that's the world I'll see. Thoughts are so powerful.
I do agree with that. Actually. I'm going to end on that note, because that's a fabulous note. I'm just going to end it there.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Michelle. We went all over the place, didn't we?
I know. It was worth the waiting for. Your interview has been amazing, actually. So I'm going to wrap things up. That's all the questions I have today. I would like to thank Dave for your time. That brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
Thank you, Michelle. Take care.
That brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, I'd like to gently encourage you to leave a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts, and share the show with another person. You can also follow me on LinkedIn or via my website, www.michellefraserconsultancy.com. Thanks again for listening, and see you next week.